The bitter cold was going to kill him, but Garrett Vance pressed forward through the howling blizzard anyway, clutching the ring in his frozen hand like a lifeline to something worth dying for. Montana territory stretched endlessly white in every direction. The December storm of 1883 obliterating any trace of the trail he had been following for the past 3 hours. His horse had gone lame 6 miles back, forcing him to shoot the poor beast to end its suffering. Now on foot, each step through knee-deep snow sent daggers of pain through his legs. His face had lost all feeling an hour ago, which probably meant frostbite. The thought should have terrified him, but all Garrett could think about was reaching Victor, reaching her door, and finally asking the question that had been burning in his chest for the past 2 years. Rose Kennedy. Just thinking her name gave him enough warmth to take another step, then another. He had met her when she first arrived in Victor with her father, a banker from Philadelphia who thought he could make his fortune in the Montana mining towns. Malcolm Kennedy had been dead wrong about that, dying of pneumonia within 8 months of their arrival, leaving Rose alone to run a failing bank in a town that barely trusted her because she was a woman. But Rose had proved everyone wrong, turning that bank into the most stable financial institution within 100 miles through sheer determination and a brilliant mind for numbers. Garrett had been one of her first customers, depositing his meager earnings from working as a ranch hand at the Triple Creek spread. He remembered walking into that bank, expecting to see Malcolm behind the desk, only to find a woman with auburn hair pinned up in a practical bun, wearing a simple gray dress, and looking at him with the most striking green eyes he had ever seen. She could not have been more than 20 at the time, young and serious and completely out of place in the rough mining town of Victor. "Can I help you?" she had asked, her Philadelphia accent still thick back then. He had stammered something about opening an account, feeling like a fool in his dusty work clothes and scuffed boots. But Rose had treated him with the same professional courtesy she would have given a cattle baron, carefully recording his deposit of $37 and explaining the interest rates with a patience that made his heart race. That had been 2 years ago. Since then, Garrett had found every excuse to visit that bank. Sometimes he deposited money. Sometimes he withdrew a few dollars. Sometimes he just asked questions about investment opportunities he could never afford. And Rose, ever professional, had helped him every single time, never letting on whether she noticed his obvious infatuation. But things had changed 6 months ago. The Triple Creek Ranch had been attacked by rustlers, and Garrett had been one of 3 men who tracked them down. The confrontation had been brief and bloody. 1 rustler dead, 2 captured, and Garrett taking a bullet through the shoulder that nearly killed him. He had spent 2 weeks recovering in the doctor's office in Victor, drifting in and out of fevered consciousness. Rose had visited him every single day. At first, he thought he was hallucinating, but she kept coming back, bringing soup she had made herself, reading to him from books she loved, sitting by his bedside even when he was too weak to speak. When he finally recovered enough to ask why, she had looked away, color rising in her cheeks. "Because I realized when I heard you had been shot that I had been waiting 2 years for you to say something, anything, that indicated you saw me as more than your banker," she said quietly. "And I thought perhaps if you survived, I might need to be the one to say something instead." That conversation had been the beginning of everything. Careful courting, since Rose's reputation in town was already precarious enough without adding scandal to it. Dinners at the hotel restaurant with proper chaperones. Walks through town in broad daylight. Church on Sundays, sitting in adjacent pews. Everything proper and correct, because Rose had worked too hard to build her position in Victor to have it destroyed by gossip. But Garrett knew what he felt, and more miraculously, Rose felt it too. She had told him so 3 weeks ago, standing on the porch of the boarding house where she rented a room, her hand warm in his despite the cold November air. "I love you, Garrett Vance," she had said, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have loved you for longer than I care to admit, and I am tired of pretending otherwise." He had kissed her then, properly and thoroughly, not caring if Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, was watching from the window. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he knew he wanted to marry this woman. Wanted to spend every day of his life making her happy, building a future together, creating something lasting in this wild territory. But he had no ring. His savings, carefully deposited in her bank over 2 years, amounted to maybe $300. Hardly enough to buy the kind of ring Rose deserved, so he had done something reckless. He had signed on for a cattle drive to Wyoming, a brutal 3-week journey in late autumn that paid $100 to any man willing to risk it. The money would be enough for a proper ring and a down payment on a small house in Victor. Enough to offer Rose something more than just his love. The drive had been every bit as terrible as promised. Freezing nights, ornery cattle, and 2 river crossings that nearly killed half the herd. But Garrett had survived, collected his pay, and immediately headed to the jeweler in Cheyenne. The ring he purchased had cost him every cent of that $100 plus 50 from his savings. A simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light like a fragment of captured starfire. The jeweler had assured him it was quality work, and Garrett had believed him because he desperately wanted to. With the ring secured in his vest pocket, he had started the journey back to Victor. The trip should have taken 5 days by horse. He had made it 4.5 days before the blizzard hit, catching him on the empty stretch between settlements with nothing but open prairie in every direction. He should have stopped, found shelter, waited it out. But he was so close to Victor, maybe 20 miles, and he knew Rose would be worried. She had known he was coming back this week, and if the storm trapped her in town wondering if he was dead somewhere in the snow, it would drive her mad. So he had pushed forward, and when his horse went lame, he had kept going on foot because turning back was no longer an option. He was committed now, for better or worse. The wind howled like a living thing, trying to tear him off his feet. Snow stung his exposed skin like thrown needles. He could no longer feel his hands or feet, which was probably a bad sign, but at least the pain had stopped. Everything felt distant now, wrapped in cotton, his thoughts slow and dreamy. Was he still heading toward Victor? He thought so, but the storm had disoriented him completely. He might be walking in circles for all he could tell. The world was nothing but white and cold and the endless howl of wind. Then, through the swirling snow, he saw a light. At first he thought it was a hallucination, a trick of his freezing brain. But the light remained steady, a warm yellow glow that cut through the storm like a beacon. He stumbled toward it, falling twice, hauling himself back to his feet through sheer stubbornness. The light grew closer, resolving into a window, then another window. A building, solid and real, emerging from the blizzard like salvation. The boarding house. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house on the edge of Victor, which meant Rose's room was on the 2nd floor, 3rd window from the left. He had stood outside this building so many times, watching that window, hoping for a glimpse of her shadow moving behind the curtains. Garrett half walked, half crawled to the front door. His frozen hands could barely grip the doorknob, and it took 3 tries before he managed to turn it. The door swung open and he fell inside, landing hard on the wooden floor of the entrance hall. Warmth. blessed, beautiful warmth that felt like fire on his frozen skin. He lay there, unable to move, vaguely aware of voices, footsteps, someone screaming, "Get the doctor! Someone get Dr. Morrison!" That was Mrs. Patterson, her voice shrill with panic. "Who is it?" Another voice, female, coming from upstairs. "I do not know, he is half frozen." More footsteps, rapid this time, descending the stairs. Then a gasp, and suddenly Rose was kneeling beside him, her hands on his face, her green eyes wide with horror. "Garrett? Oh God, Garrett, what have you done?" He tried to speak, but his jaw would not work properly. All that came out was a groan. "Help me get him to the fire," Rose commanded, and suddenly there were hands lifting him, dragging him across the floor to the fireplace in the sitting room. They laid him on the hearth rug, and Rose began working at his frozen coat, trying to peel it off him. "Carefully, Miss Kennedy, Mrs. Patterson warned. His skin might tear if the fabric is frozen to him." Rose ignored her, finally getting the coat off to reveal his vest underneath. She reached for the vest buttons, and Garrett suddenly remembered the ring. With tremendous effort, he raised one hand, grabbed her wrist. "Pocket," he managed to croak. "Vest pocket." Rose stared at him, confused, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the small wrapped package. The paper was wet and half destroyed, but the box inside was intact. She opened it with trembling fingers, and her breath caught when she saw the ring. "You walked through a blizzard to bring me this." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Marry me," Garrett said, the words slurring but clear enough. "Rose Kennedy, will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You absolute fool. You could have died. You probably have frostbite. You might lose your fingers or toes or worse, and you did this to bring me a ring? Answer is not yes or no," he managed. "Yes." She was crying and laughing at the same time. "Yes, you stubborn, reckless, wonderful man. Yes, I will marry you. Now please, please do not die on me." Dr. Morrison arrived 10 minutes later, a gruff man in his 50s who took one look at Garrett and started barking orders. They moved him to a guest room on the first floor, stripped off his frozen clothes, and wrapped him in blankets. The doctor examined his hands and feet with a grim expression. "Bad frostbite on both hands and feet," he announced. "We will need to warm him slowly. Too fast and we could cause more damage. The next 24 hours will tell us if we can save all his fingers and toes." Rose, who had refused to leave his side, went pale. "But he will live, probably. He is young and strong, but he is going to be in considerable pain once the feeling returns." That turned out to be the understatement of the century. As Garrett's extremities slowly thawed over the next hours, the pain hit him in waves that made him cry out despite his best efforts to stay quiet. Rose held his hand through all of it, even though he knew he must be hurting her with his grip, whispering reassurances and promises that everything would be all right. The first night was the worst. Fever set in as his body fought to recover from the trauma of extreme cold. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes raving. During his lucid moments, he was always aware of Rose beside him, her cool hand on his forehead, her voice reading to him from one of her books. "Why did you do it?" she asked during one of his clearer moments, her voice thick with exhaustion. It was nearly dawn, gray light filtering through the window. "Why risk your life like that? I would have waited. I would have waited forever if I had to." "Wanted to give you something beautiful," Garrett said, his voice rough. "Wanted to be worthy of you. You have always been worthy of me, you impossible man." She leaned down and kissed his forehead gently. "I fell in love with a ranch hand who deposited $37 and treated me with respect when most men in this town thought a woman had no business running a bank. I did not need a ring to know you loved me. But you deserved one anyway." She smiled, though her eyes were wet. I suppose I cannot argue with that. It is a beautiful ring. Put it on. What? Put it on, he repeated. Want to see it on your hand. Rose hesitated, then slipped the ring onto her left hand. It fit perfectly, the diamond catching the early morning light. She held up her hand, admiring it, and Garrett felt a surge of satisfaction despite the pain racking his body. There, he said. Now everyone knows you are mine. And you are mine, she replied firmly, which means you do not get to do anything this reckless ever again. Do you understand me, Garrett Vance? Yes, madam. Dr. Morrison returned later that morning, examining Garrett's hands and feet with a more optimistic expression than he had worn the night before. Well, you are luckier than you deserve to be, he announced. Looks like you will keep all your fingers and toes, though the tips of 3 fingers and 2 toes are going to be touch and go for a while. No gripping anything tightly for at least a month, and you will need to be careful about cold exposure for the rest of your life. But you should make a full recovery. The relief that washed over Rose's face made all the pain worth it. Garrett spent the next week recovering in that guest room, with Rose visiting him every morning before she opened the bank and every evening after she closed it. Mrs. Patterson, who had always been strict about propriety, seemed to have softened her stance given the circumstances. She even let Rose take her meals with Garrett in his room, though she insisted on leaving the door open. I suppose since you are engaged, some allowances can be made, Mrs. Patterson said primly. Though I expect the wedding to happen as soon as Mr. Vance is well enough to stand before a minister. Yes, madam, Rose replied, though her eyes sparkled with amusement once the older woman left. She is a dragon, Garrett said. She is a woman trying to maintain respectability in a town full of miners and cowboys, Rose corrected. I appreciate that about her, actually. When I first arrived in Victor, she was one of the few women who treated me as anything other than an oddity or a threat. A threat, Rose shrugged. Some of the married women in town saw a young, unmarried woman running a business as a potential problem. As if I was going to steal their husbands with the power of compound interest and loan documentation. Garrett laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his still healing body. Cannot imagine you as a home wrecker. I should hope not, since I only have eyes for one stubborn cowboy who apparently has no sense of self-preservation. They fell into an easy rhythm during his recovery. Rose would arrive in the morning with breakfast, usually something she had cooked herself in the boarding house kitchen. They would eat together while she told him about the previous day at the bank, the various customers and their financial dramas. Then she would read to him for an hour before leaving for work. In the evenings, she would return and they would talk about everything and nothing. Their childhoods, their dreams, their plans for the future. Garrett learned that Rose had grown up in Philadelphia, the only daughter of a banker who had progressive ideas about women and education. Malcolm Kennedy had taught his daughter everything he knew about finance, treating her as the son he never had. When his health began to fail, and the Philadelphia doctors recommended a drier climate, he had decided to try his luck in Montana Territory, bringing Rose with him because she had no other family. I think he knew he was dying, Rose said quietly one evening. He wanted to secure my future before he went, and he thought establishing a bank in a growing town would do that. He was not entirely wrong. The bank has done well, far better than expected. You have done well, Garrett corrected. Malcolm started it, but you are the one who made it succeed. Rose smiled. I suppose that is true, though it has not been easy. Do you know how many men have come into my bank and demanded to speak to the real banker, or who have refused to take financial advice from a woman? I have had to work twice as hard as any man to prove I know what I am doing. Anyone who spends 5 minutes talking to you knows you are brilliant. You are biased. That does not make it less true." She leaned over and kissed him, gentle and sweet. These moments were Garrett's favorite, when the world narrowed down to just the two of them, when her brilliant mind and sharp wit were focused entirely on him. "Tell me about your family," Rose said, settling back into her chair beside his bed. "You never talk about them." Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "Not much to tell. My father died when I was 12, kicked by a horse. My mother remarried 2 years later to a man who did not want another man's son around. So I left at 15, found work on ranches, and have been moving around ever since." "Do you have any siblings?" "2 half-sisters, but I have not seen them since I left. They would be about 14 and 12 now, I suppose." Rose reached out and took his hand carefully, mindful of his still healing fingers. "That must have been hard, being pushed out of your own family like that. It was a long time ago." "That does not mean it did not hurt." He looked at her, this woman who saw through his casual dismissals to the pain beneath. "No, it does not." "When we are married, we will make our own family," Rose said firmly. "A better one. One where everyone is wanted and loved. I would like that." 2 weeks after his arrival, Garrett was finally well enough to walk without assistance, though his frostbitten fingers and toes still pained him considerably. Dr. Morrison pronounced him fit enough to leave the boarding house, with strict instructions about keeping his extremities warm and dry. "Give those fingers and toes another month before you do any hard labor," the doctor warned. "And I mean it, Vance. You try working with those hands too soon, you could do permanent damage." This presented a problem. Garrett had no income, having spent nearly all his savings on the ring. He needed to work, but the only work he knew was ranch work, which required functional hands. He was pondering this dilemma while slowly making his way to the bank to meet Rose when he ran into his former boss, Harold Kelly, owner of the Triple Creek Ranch. "Vance. Heard you nearly froze to death playing hero," Harold said, clapping him on the shoulder hard enough to make Garrett stagger. "How are the fingers?" "Healing, sir. Should be good as new in a month or so. Glad to hear it." "Listen, I was sorry to lose you on that cattle drive, but I understand a man has got to make money when opportunity knocks. You looking for work?" "I am, sir, but the doctor says I cannot do ranch work for at least another month." Harold stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Tell you what. My youngest son Edward has been handling the books for the ranch, and he is making a damn mess of it. Numbers are not his strong suit. I do not suppose you have any head for figures." "Not really, sir." Well, what about that fiancée of yours? Heard she is some kind of financial wizard." "You think she would be willing to come out to the ranch once or twice a week to sort out our books and teach Edward the right way to do it?" "I would pay her, of course. Say $10 a week." Garrett's heart lifted. $10 a week was good money, and it would help Rose as well as himself. "I can ask her, sir." "You do that. Tell her to come by the ranch if she is interested, and we will work out the details." Garrett continued to the bank, finding Rose behind her desk as usual, carefully reviewing a loan application. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that made his chest tighten with love. "You are walking well today," she observed, feeling better, "and I have a business proposition for you." He explained Harold Kelly's offer, watching as Rose considered it with the same focused attention she gave all financial matters. $10 a week for bookkeeping services, she mused. That is fair compensation, and it would be good to diversify my income beyond just the bank. Yes, I think I can make that work. I could go out to the ranch on Sunday afternoons after church. Harold will be pleased, so am I actually. Means we will both have income while I am healing. Rose stood and came around the desk, reaching up to cup his face gently. We are going to be all right, you know, both of us. We will build something good here in Victor. I know. He leaned down and kissed her, not caring that they were in the bank where anyone could walk in and see them. "When should we get married? Are you asking me to set a date?" "I am." Rose thought for a moment. "Christmas. 3 weeks from now. It will give you time to heal more and we can start the new year as husband and wife. Christmas it is." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Rose proved to be as talented at ranch bookkeeping as she was at running a bank, quickly sorting out the mess Edward Kelly had made of the Triple Creek accounts. The young man was embarrassed but grateful, following her instructions with the dedication of a student who had finally found a teacher who made sense. Garrett, meanwhile, focused on healing and preparing for the wedding. Since he could not do heavy work, he found odd jobs around Victor that paid a little and kept him busy. Sweeping out the general store, delivering messages, helping the blacksmith with tasks that did not require a strong grip. The money was not much, but every dollar helped. He also used the time to find them a place to live. Rose's room at the boarding house was too small for a married couple, and Garrett wanted to give her something better. He found a small house on the outskirts of Victor, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it had a good roof and a solid wood stove. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Harrison, was moving to California to live with her daughter and was willing to sell for $200, with $50 down, and the rest paid over the next year. Garrett brought Rose to see it on a cold December afternoon, watching nervously as she walked through the small rooms, examining everything with a critical eye. "The stove is good quality," she said, running her hand over the iron surface. "And the windows are solid. This main room could serve as both parlor and dining area, and the bedroom is a decent size. Kitchen needs some work, but nothing major. So you like it?" Rose turned to him, her eyes soft. "I love it. It is perfect for us to start with." They sealed the deal with Mrs. Harrison that afternoon, and suddenly, Garrett was a homeowner. Well, a partial homeowner with a significant debt, but still. It felt real in a way that made his hands shake as he signed the papers. "We are really doing this," he said to Rose that evening as they sat together in their almost home, wrapped in blankets against the cold while they planned where furniture would go. "We really are," Rose agreed. "In 2 weeks I will be Rose Vance, wife of the most stubborn man in Montana Territory." "You could keep your name if you want," Garrett offered. "Kennedy, it is a good name and the bank knows you as Rose Kennedy." She considered this, then shook her head. "No, I want to be Rose Vance. I want to share your name, build a life with you under that name. The bank can adjust." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the blizzard that had nearly killed Garrett just a distant memory. The church in Victor was small and drafty, but someone had decorated it with pine branches and red ribbon, making it festive for the holiday. Half the town turned out for the wedding, curious to see the lady banker marry the cowboy who had walked through a blizzard to propose. Garrett stood at the front of the church in his best suit, which he had bought 2 days ago with money borrowed from Rose herself. His hands were shaking, though whether from nervousness or lingering damage from the frostbite, he could not say. Beside him, Harold Kelly stood as his best man, looking proud as if Garrett were his own son. Then Rose appeared at the back of the church, and Garrett forgot how to breathe. She wore a simple white dress, nothing fancy or elaborate, but she looked more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. Her auburn hair was down for once, falling in waves past her shoulders, and she carried a small bouquet of pine branches tied with white ribbon. Mrs. Patterson walked beside her, serving as her attendant since Rose had no family in Victor. Rose walked down the aisle with her head high, her green eyes locked on Garrett's face. When she reached him, she handed her bouquet to Mrs. Patterson and took both his hands in hers, squeezing gently. Ready to make an honest woman of me, she whispered. More than ready, he replied. The ceremony was simple and brief, the minister reading from Scripture and leading them through their vows. Garrett spoke his promises clearly, meaning every word, to love and cherish in sickness and in health for richer or poorer. Everything he had, everything he was, belonged to this woman now. Rose's voice was steady as she made her own vows, her eyes never leaving his face. When the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett pulled her close and kissed her thoroughly, earning a smattering of applause and some good-natured whooping from the cowboys in attendance. They held a small reception in the church hall, with cake donated by the baker and coffee provided by the hotel. People came up to congratulate them, shake Garrett's hand, kiss Rose's cheek. It was overwhelming and wonderful, this acceptance by the community, this recognition of their union. "Never thought I would see the day Rose Kennedy settled down," one of the miners said, grinning. "Figured she was married to that bank of hers." "A woman can do both," Rose replied coolly, though she was smiling. "Run a business and have a personal life." "Well, you picked a good man," the miner said, nodding at Garrett. "Anyone willing to walk 20 miles in a blizzard for a woman is worth keeping." As the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin, Garrett found himself standing with Rose near the window, watching the sun set over Victor. Her hand was in his, the ring he had nearly died bringing her catching the golden light. "Happy?" he asked, incredibly. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Though I suspect the hard work is just beginning. Marriage is work. Everything worth having takes work," Rose said. "But I think we are up to the challenge." They moved into their little house that evening, with help from Harold Kelly and some of the Triple Creek Ranch hands who loaded their few belongings onto a wagon and hauled them across town. Rose did not have much. Her clothes, her books, some kitchen items. Garrett had even less. But together, their possessions filled the small house and made it feel like a home. Their first night as husband and wife was spent sitting by the fire, wrapped in blankets, talking about their plans for the future. Rose wanted to expand the bank's services, perhaps offer investment opportunities for the miners and ranchers who were starting to make real money in the territory. Garrett wanted to eventually buy some land and start his own ranch, something small but profitable. "We could do both," Rose said thoughtfully. "If we are careful with money, invest wisely, we could build something significant. Together," Garrett said, "always together." The winter passed slowly, as winters in Montana always did. Garrett's hands and feet healed completely, though Dr. Morrison had been right about the cold sensitivity. He had to be careful about exposure, always wearing gloves and heavy socks when working outside. But by February, he was back to full ranch work at the Triple Creek, earning good wages and saving every penny he could. Rose continued running the bank with her usual efficiency, while also handling the bookkeeping for the Triple Creek and 2 other ranches that had heard about her skills. The extra income meant they were able to pay off the house by April, a full 8 months ahead of schedule. "We own this house outright now," Rose said, staring at the deed with something like wonder. "No debt. It is completely ours." "You are a financial genius," Garrett said, pulling her into his arms. "We are a good team," she corrected. "You work hard, I manage the money wisely. Together we make it work." Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. The town of Victor was growing rapidly, with new settlers arriving almost weekly. The bank was busier than ever, and Rose hired an assistant, a young man named Peter who had studied bookkeeping in Chicago before heading west for adventure. "This will free me up to focus on the larger accounts and investments," Rose explained to Garrett over dinner one evening. "And Peter is quite competent. I think he will work out well." "Just make sure he knows you are the boss," Garrett said, Rose laughed. Oh, I think I have made that quite clear. Summer was the best season Garrett could remember. The weather was beautiful, the ranch work satisfying, and coming home each evening to Rose waiting for him felt like a miracle he had done nothing to deserve. They would eat dinner together, talking about their days, then sit on the small porch of their house and watch the sunset over the mountains. I never thought I could be this happy, Garrett admitted one warm July evening. Growing up, I never had a real home, never had anyone who was truly mine. And now I have you and this house and a place in this community. It feels almost too good to be real. Rose reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. It is real. We built this together and we will keep building it. This is just the beginning. In August, Rose discovered she was pregnant. She told Garrett over breakfast one morning, her voice casual but her eyes bright with emotion. The baby should arrive sometime in late February or early March, she said. I have already spoken to Dr. Morrison, and he says I am perfectly healthy and should have no problems. Garrett sat there, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, trying to process what she had just said. A baby. We are having a baby. Yes, we are. He set down the cup carefully, then stood and pulled Rose into his arms, holding her as tightly as he dared. I am going to be a father. You are going to be a wonderful father, Rose said, her voice muffled against his chest. And I am terrified and excited and so happy I could cry. Then cry, Garrett said. I will probably join you. They stood there together, holding each other, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. A baby. Their baby. A family of their own, something Garrett had dreamed of but never quite believed would happen. Rose continued working at the bank well into her pregnancy, stubbornly refusing to let her condition slow her down. Some of the more conservative women in town clucked their tongues and said it was unseemly for a pregnant woman to be conducting business, but Rose ignored them. She had never let other people's opinions dictate her life, and she was not about to start now. Besides, she told Garrett when he suggested she might want to rest more, I am pregnant, not infirm. Women have been working while pregnant since the beginning of time. I will be fine. And she was fine, remaining healthy and energetic throughout the autumn months. The bank continued to thrive under her management, and the extra bookkeeping work brought in additional income that they saved carefully for the baby's arrival. Garrett spent his free time preparing their little house for the new addition. He built a cradle from scratch, carefully sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, then painting it a soft cream color. He added shelves to the bedroom for baby clothes and supplies. He even dug a new well closer to the house, so Rose would not have to walk as far for water once the baby arrived. Winter came again, and with it the same brutal cold that had nearly killed Garrett the year before. But this year, he was safe and warm in his own home, with his pregnant wife beside him, and the memory of that desperate walk through the blizzard felt like something from another lifetime. Hard to believe it has only been a year, Rose said one snowy December evening as they sat by the fire. She was knitting tiny socks for the baby, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite her swollen belly. A year ago you were half frozen in Mrs. Patterson's entrance hall, and I was trying not to panic while also being furious with you for risking your life. Would you have said yes if I had proposed differently? Garrett asked. Maybe just asked you on a normal day without all the drama. Rose considered this. Probably, but it would not have been as memorable. Every time I look at this ring, I am reminded that you walked 20 miles through a blizzard to bring it to me, that you loved me enough to risk everything. That is not something I will ever forget. I would do it again, Garrett said quietly. Walk 100 miles if I had to. You are worth any risk. Rose set down her knitting and moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. Let us hope you never have to prove that again. I much prefer having you alive and healthy and here with me. Christmas came again, marking their first anniversary. They celebrated quietly at home, exchanging simple gifts. Garrett gave Rose a new ledger book bound in fine leather for her business records. Rose gave Garrett a pair of sturdy work gloves lined with wool, perfect for protecting his still sensitive hands from the cold. "Practical gifts for practical people," Rose said, smiling. "The best kind," Garrett agreed. In late February, during a cold snap that froze the water in the well solid, Rose went into labor. It was early morning, just after dawn, and Garrett was getting ready to head to the ranch when Rose suddenly gasped and doubled over. "The baby," she managed to say. "Garrett, it is time." He ran for Dr. Morrison, covering the quarter-mile to the doctor's house in record time despite the ice and snow. The doctor grabbed his bag and followed Garrett back to the house, where they found Rose calmly timing her contractions while leaning against the kitchen table. "About 5 minutes apart," she reported. "Started maybe 20 minutes ago. Let us get you to bed," Dr. Morrison said. "Vance, go fetch Mrs. Patterson. I will need her assistance." The next 12 hours were the longest of Garrett's life. Mrs. Patterson arrived and took charge with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had attended dozens of births. She shooed Garrett out of the bedroom, insisting he would just be in the way, but he could hear Rose through the door. Her breathing, her occasional cries of pain, Mrs. Patterson's calm instructions. Harold Kelly stopped by mid-morning, having heard the news somehow. "Babies come when they want to," he said philosophically, settling into a chair to wait with Garrett. "Nothing to do but wait and pray." "She is so strong," Garrett said, pacing the small main room like a caged animal. "But what if something goes wrong? What if she needs help we cannot provide here? Morrison is a good doctor. He has delivered half the babies in this county. Your Rose is in good hands." The sun was setting when Garrett finally heard the sound he had been waiting for. A baby's cry, thin and wavering but definitely there. He froze, his heart pounding, and then Mrs. Patterson opened the bedroom door. "Congratulations, Mr. Vance," she said, smiling broadly. "You have a healthy son." A son. Garrett felt tears spring to his eyes as he rushed into the bedroom, finding Rose propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Dr. Morrison was cleaning up, looking satisfied. "Mother and baby are both doing well," he announced. "It was a good delivery, no complications. You are a lucky man, Vance." Garrett barely heard him, his entire attention focused on Rose and the baby in her arms. He knelt beside the bed, looking down at the tiny face peering out from the blankets. His son. Their son. Dark hair, eyes scrunched closed, one tiny fist waving in the air. "He is perfect," Garrett whispered. "He is," Rose agreed. Her voice was tired but happy, her green eyes soft as she looked between her husband and her son. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his newborn son, Garrett knew exactly what he wanted. "Malcolm," he said. "After your father, Malcolm Vance." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that, name him after my father." "Malcolm Kennedy gave me the greatest gift of my life when he brought you to Montana," Garrett said. "Seems only right to honor him." "Malcolm Vance," Rose said softly, looking down at the baby. "Yes, that is perfect." The next weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, but Garrett had never been happier. He took a leave from the ranch, with Harold's blessing, to stay home and help Rose care for the baby. Malcolm was a good baby, as babies went, though he had healthy lungs and was not shy about using them when hungry or uncomfortable. Garrett discovered that fatherhood suited him. He loved holding his son, feeling the warm weight of the baby in his arms, watching Malcolm sleep or make funny faces or grip Garrett's finger with surprising strength. He loved watching Rose nurse the baby, the tender way she held Malcolm, the soft songs she sang to soothe him. "We made this," Garrett said one night, watching Rose rock Malcolm to sleep. "This perfect little person, that is miraculous." "It really is," Rose agreed, "though I could do with a full night's sleep at some point." By the time Malcolm was 2 months old, Rose was ready to return to work part-time. She had been managing the bank from home as much as possible, with Peter handling the day-to-day operations, but she missed being in the thick of things. They worked out a schedule where Garrett would watch Malcolm in the mornings while Rose went to the bank, and Rose would take over in the afternoons when Garrett went to the ranch. It was exhausting, trying to balance work and parenthood, but they made it function through teamwork and determination. Harold was understanding about Garrett's need for flexible hours, and the bank staff had proved themselves capable during Rose's absence. "We are managing," Rose said one evening as they sat together, Malcolm asleep in his cradle between them. "Barely, some days, but we are managing." "We are doing more than managing," Garrett corrected. "We are building a good life for our son. That is what matters." As Malcolm grew from infant to baby to toddler, the little house that had seemed perfect for 2 adults started to feel cramped. Rose brought up the possibility of adding on to the house or even building a new one, somewhere with more room for their growing family. "Growing family?" Garrett asked. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" Rose smiled. "I am saying that Malcolm will have a little brother or sister by next spring, and that maybe we should start planning for a larger house before we are completely out of space." So they began planning. Rose, with her financial acumen, calculated exactly how much they could afford to spend. Garrett, with his practical ranch experience, designed a house that would be functional and comfortable. They settled on a plot of land about a mile outside Victor, 5 acres with a good creek running through it, and enough grazing land for a few horses and maybe some cattle eventually. Construction began in the summer, with Garrett doing much of the work himself with help from some of the Triple Creek hands who owed him favors. It was hard labor, especially in the Montana heat, but Garrett threw himself into it with enthusiasm. This was his land, his house, built with his own hands for his family. That meant something. The new house was finished by October, just in time for them to move in before the snow came. It was larger than their first house, with 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a sitting room big enough for the family to gather comfortably. Rose cried when she saw it completed, and Garrett was not entirely dry-eyed himself. "This is ours," Rose said, standing in the middle of the empty sitting room. "Really, truly ours, built by us for us. I never dreamed I could have something like this." "We have come a long way from that first little house," Garrett agreed. "We have come a long way from you half frozen on Mrs. Patterson's floor," Rose countered. "That feels like a lifetime ago, and yet it has only been 3 years. 3 years. Garrett marveled at how much had changed in such a short time. 3 years ago he had been a rootless ranch hand with no real prospects. Now he was a husband, a father, a homeowner with a real stake in the community. All because he had been stubborn enough to walk through a blizzard to reach the woman he loved. Their second child, a daughter they named Ruth, arrived in early April. The birth was easier than Malcolm's had been, and Rose recovered quickly. Ruth was a quieter baby than her brother had been, content to observe the world with solemn, dark eyes that reminded Garrett of his own. "She is going to be a thinker," Rose predicted. "I can already tell." Malcolm, now 2.5 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside her cradle for long stretches, talking to her in his toddler babble, gently touching her tiny hands. It melted Garrett's heart to see his children together, this family they had created. As the years passed, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Garrett eventually left the Triple Creek Ranch to focus on building up his own small cattle operation on their land. It was hard work and the profits were modest at first, but he loved being his own boss, working his own land. Rose continued running the bank, now with a staff of 3 to help manage the increased business as Victor continued to grow. They added 2 more children to their family. Another son named James, born when Malcolm was 5 and Ruth was 3. And finally another daughter, Grace, who arrived when Rose was 32 and Garrett was 34. 4 children total, filling their house with noise and laughter and the constant chaos of family life. "Remember when it was just the 2 of us?" Rose said one evening, surveying the disaster zone that was their sitting room. Toys everywhere, Malcolm and Ruth arguing over a book, James toddling around getting into everything, baby Grace crying in her cradle. Quiet dinners, peaceful evenings, uninterrupted conversations. "Vaguely," Garrett said, rescuing James from trying to climb the bookshelf. "Do you miss it?" Rose looked around at the chaos, at their 4 children, at the life they had built together. Not even for a second. Malcolm grew into a serious boy who loved numbers like his mother and could calculate figures in his head with startling speed. Ruth was the dreamer, always reading, always asking questions about the world beyond Victor. James was pure energy, constantly moving, constantly exploring, keeping his parents on their toes. And Grace, their baby, was sunshine personified, quick to laugh and impossible to stay angry at. Raising 4 children while also running businesses was not easy. There were difficult days, moments when Garrett and Rose were both exhausted and short-tempered with each other. But they had learned early in their marriage to talk through problems, to work as a team, to remember why they had chosen each other in the first place. One particularly hard day when Malcolm was 8, Ruth was 6, James was 3, and Grace was barely 1. Everything seemed to go wrong at once. Malcolm broke his arm falling from a tree. Ruth came down with a fever. James somehow got into the barn and let all the chickens loose, and Grace would not stop crying, no matter what Rose tried. Garrett came in from a long day of mending fences to find Rose sitting on the floor of the kitchen, surrounded by chaos, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I cannot be a mother and run a bank and keep this house running and be everything everyone needs me to be. I just cannot." Garrett sat down beside her on the floor, pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried. Malcolm was at the doctor getting his arm set. Ruth was sleeping off her fever. James had been sent to his room for the chicken incident. Grace had finally worn herself out and was asleep in her cradle. "You do not have to be everything to everyone," Garrett said quietly. "You just have to be you, and you are already more than enough." "I feel like I am failing at everything," Rose said. "You are not failing. You are human. We are both human, doing our best to raise 4 children and build a life in this wild country. Some days are going to be harder than others. That does not mean we are failing." Rose pulled back and looked at him, her green eyes red from crying. "How do you stay so calm?" "Because I have you," Garrett said simply. "Because I know that whatever happens, we face it together. We walked through a blizzard to get here, Rose. Everything since then is just details." She laughed, a watery sound but genuine. "You are never going to let me forget that blizzard, are you? Never. It is our story, the foundation everything else is built on." They sat there on the kitchen floor together, holding each other, drawing strength from each other. And gradually the chaos settled. Ruth's fever broke. Malcolm came home with his arm in a splint, proud of his injury. James learned that chickens were not to be freed on a whim. Grace continued being Grace, bringing joy even on the hardest days. The years continued to pass. Malcolm at 12 showed such aptitude for mathematics that Rose started teaching him advanced bookkeeping, preparing him to potentially take over the bank someday if he wanted. Ruth at 10 discovered a love for teaching, gathering the younger children in the neighborhood for impromptu lessons. James at 7 finally channeled his boundless energy into working alongside Garrett with the cattle, proving to have a natural way with animals. And Grace at 5 was everyone's favorite, charming and sweet and impossibly bright. Victor continued to grow and change around them. The Montana Territory became the state of Montana in 1889, a momentous occasion celebrated with parades and speeches. The bank expanded, adding a second floor and more staff. The cattle operation grew from a few head to a respectable herd of nearly 100. The house saw additions and improvements, growing with the family it sheltered. Through it all, Garrett and Rose remained partners in every sense of the word. They still made time for each other, even with 4 children demanding attention. Date nights at the hotel restaurant when they could find a sitter. Long talks on the porch after the children were asleep. Stolen kisses in quiet moments. The foundation they had built during that first year of marriage remained strong, supporting everything they built on top of it. When Garrett turned 40 and Rose turned 38, they celebrated with a party that drew half the town of Victor. Their children, now ranging from Malcolm at 16 to Grace at 11, helped prepare food and decorations. The house was filled with friends and neighbors, with laughter and music and stories shared about the couple who had become pillars of their community. Harold Kelly, now in his 70s and mostly retired from ranch work, stood to make a toast. "I have known Garrett Vance for nearly 20 years," he said. "Watched him grow from a green ranch hand into the man he is today. And I watched him do the craziest damn thing I have ever seen. Walk 20 miles through a blizzard just to propose to a woman. At the time, I thought he was touched in the head. But looking at these two now, at the life they have built, the family they have raised, I realized that walk was not crazy at all. It was the sanest thing he ever did." To Garrett and Rose, to Garrett and Rose. The room echoed, raising glasses. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the children were in bed, Garrett and Rose stood on their porch, looking out at the land they had built their life on. The stars were brilliant overhead, the night air cool but not cold, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Rose asked, her hand in Garrett's. "If you had waited out that blizzard instead of pushing through, if you had proposed some other way, some other time." "Sometimes," Garrett admitted. "But I always come to the same conclusion. Everything happened exactly the way it needed to. That blizzard, that desperate walk, showing up at your door half frozen with a ring in my pocket, that was us. That was our beginning. Everything good in my life came from that decision to keep walking, to not give up, to reach you no matter what." Rose leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "I am glad you are stubborn. I am glad you said yes." They stood there together in comfortable silence, two people who had built something lasting in a wild and uncertain world. 4 children sleeping safely in the house behind them. A successful bank, a thriving ranch, a community they had become part of, and most importantly, each other. As the years continued to pass, Garrett and Rose watched their children grow into adults with pride and occasional bewilderment. Malcolm at 18 took over the majority of the bank's bookkeeping, showing the same brilliant mind for numbers his mother possessed. At 19, he announced his intention to go to college in the East to study finance, something that would have been impossible without the savings Rose had carefully built over the years. "Are you sure?" Rose asked, though she was beaming with pride. It is a big step, leaving Montana for somewhere like Boston or New York. I am sure, Ma, Malcolm said, but I will come back. This is home. I just want to learn more, bring back new ideas to help the bank grow. Ruth, at 16, had become the unofficial teacher for the younger children in Victor, holding classes in the church hall 3 days a week. She had a patience and warmth that made children gravitate toward her, and she was already talking about starting an official school once she was a bit older. James, at 13, was Garrett's shadow, learning everything he could about cattle and ranching. He had a gift for it, understanding the animals and the land in a way that could not be taught. Garrett sometimes watched his middle son work and saw himself at that age, hungry to learn, eager to prove himself. And Grace, at 11, was still the family's heart, bringing them together with her infectious enthusiasm and creativity. She loved music, teaching herself to play the old piano Rose had bought for the sitting room, filling the house with melodies that made everyone stop and listen. We did all right, didn't we? Garrett said to Rose one evening, watching their 4 children gathered around the dinner table, talking and laughing and occasionally bickering as siblings did. Raised 4 good people. We did more than all right, Rose replied. We raised 4 exceptional people. Each one different, each one remarkable in their own way. As their children began leaving home to pursue their own paths, the house that had once been full of noise and chaos grew quieter. Malcolm left for college in Boston, sending letters home weekly describing his studies and the strange East Coast culture. Ruth moved to Helena, the state capital, where she attended the new normal school to become a certified teacher. James stayed close to home, but at 17 he started courting Emma, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, spending more and more time away. Even Grace, their baby, was growing up, now 15 and interested in possibly studying music more seriously. They were losing their children to the world, which was natural and right, but it still left an ache. It is just us again, Rose said one quiet evening. Grace was at a friend's house, and the house was empty except for the 2 of them. Like the early days before the children came. How does that feel? Garrett asked. Rose thought about it. Strange, wonderful, a little sad, but mostly wonderful. I love our children and I am so proud of the people they are becoming. But I also love this, just us. We started here and in a way we are coming back to it. They had settled comfortably into their late 40s now, both of them still active and healthy but also aware of time passing. Garrett's hands ached in the winter, legacy of his frostbite all those years ago. Rose had to start wearing reading glasses for her bookwork. But they were blessed with good health overall, and they took nothing for granted. James married Emma when he was 20, in a beautiful ceremony that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Ruth came home for the wedding, bringing with her a young man named David, a teacher she had met in Helena. Malcolm could not make it back from Boston, but he sent a long letter of congratulations and a generous monetary gift. Grace, at 18, announced her intention to go to San Francisco to study music at a conservatory there. This time, Rose and Garrett were prepared for the departure, though it still hurt to see their youngest child preparing to leave. I will write constantly, Grace promised, and I will come home for summers. This is not goodbye forever, just goodbye for now. And so, at 50 and 48 respectively, Garrett and Rose found themselves alone in the house they had built for their growing family. The silence was profound at first, almost unsettling. But gradually, they rediscovered the rhythm they had shared in those early years of marriage. Quiet dinners together, long conversations in the evening, working side by side, Garrett on the ranch, Rose at the bank. They had more time for each other now, and they used it well. They took a trip to San Francisco to visit Grace at her conservatory, marveling at the city and the ocean beyond. They traveled to Helena to see Ruth, who was now teaching at a large public school and engaged to David. They even made the long journey to Boston to visit Malcolm, who had graduated and was working at a major financial institution, but planning to return to Montana within the year. "I have learned what I needed to learn," Malcolm told them over dinner at a fancy Boston restaurant. "Now I want to come home and put it to use. The West is growing, changing. There are opportunities there that do not exist here in the settled East. I want to be part of that." He returned to Victor 6 months later and took over the day-to-day operations of the bank, freeing Rose to step back into more of an advisory role. She was 50 now and ready to slow down a little, though she could not imagine fully retiring. The bank had been her life's work for nearly 30 years. It was part of who she was. Ruth married David in Helena in a ceremony that brought the whole family together. Malcolm came from Victor, James and Emma from their ranch, Grace from San Francisco. Garrett and Rose stood together watching their second child marry, feeling the bittersweet joy of seeing their children grown and happy. James and Emma had their first child that same year, a boy they named Garrett after his grandfather. Holding his grandson for the first time, Garrett was overcome with emotion. This tiny person represented continuity, the family line continuing forward, the life he and Rose had built extending into the future. "We are grandparents," he said to Rose, both of them staring down at baby Garrett in wonder. "We are," Rose agreed. "How did we get old enough to be grandparents?" "We are not old," Garrett protested. "We are just experienced." Rose laughed, the sound filling the room with warmth. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, dear." More grandchildren followed. Ruth and David had twin girls. Malcolm married a woman named Sarah he met in Boston, bringing her back to Montana, and they had a son. Even Grace eventually married a musician she met in San Francisco, settling there but visiting Montana regularly, and had 2 daughters. The years rolled on, bringing changes large and small. Victor continued to grow, now a proper town with paved streets and electric lights. The bank expanded again, now one of the most respected financial institutions in Montana. The ranch, now run primarily by James with Garrett advising, had grown to several hundred head of cattle and was profitable enough to support both families comfortably. Garrett and Rose, now in their 60s, settled into a comfortable semi-retirement. They still lived in the house they had built, though James had tried several times to convince them to move into something smaller and easier to maintain. But they refused. This house held their memories, their life together. They would stay here as long as they were able. They spent their days working a little, playing with grandchildren a lot, and enjoying the peaceful companionship of a marriage that had lasted nearly 4 decades. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset, holding hands like young lovers. They still talked about everything and nothing, still shared private jokes and knowing looks. "You ever regret it?" Garrett asked one evening. He was 65 now, his hair mostly gray, his hands gnarled from years of hard work. But his eyes, when he looked at Rose, held the same love they always had. Marrying a ranch hand with no prospects. Rose, 63 and still beautiful despite the silver in her auburn hair and the lines around her eyes, looked at him with exasperation and affection. "After 40 years, 4 children and more grandchildren than I can count on one hand, you are still asking me that question." "Just making sure." "Garrett Vance, you walked 20 miles through a blizzard to ask me to marry you. You built this house with your own hands. You have been my partner, my support, my love for 40 years. You gave me a family, a home, A life richer than anything I could have imagined when I was a scared young woman trying to run a bank in a strange new town. So no, I have never regretted it, not for a single moment." Garrett pulled her close, kissing her with the same passion he had felt as a young man, proving that some things never changed no matter how many years passed. When Garrett was 70, his health began to fail. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down of a body that had worked hard for 7 decades. His hands, damaged by frostbite all those years ago, finally gave him too much trouble to do ranch work. His knees ached from years of riding. His breathing grew labored with any exertion. Rose, at 68, was healthier but slowing down as well. She had finally fully retired from the bank, handing it over completely to Malcolm, who ran it with the same skill and integrity his mother had shown. They spent most of their time at home now, content with quiet days and visits from their children and grandchildren. One cold December morning, exactly 47 years after that desperate walk through the blizzard, Garrett woke to find snow falling outside their bedroom window. Heavy, thick flakes that promised a serious storm. He lay in bed, watching the snow, remembering another storm so long ago. "What are you thinking about?" Rose asked, stirring beside him. "The blizzard," Garrett said. "The one that brought me to you." Rose propped herself up on one elbow, looking at him with concern. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling grateful," Garrett said. "That I was stubborn enough to keep walking that day, that you were kind enough to say yes despite my arriving half frozen and half dead on your doorstep. That we built this life together." Rose leaned down and kissed him softly. "We built a beautiful life." "We did." They spent that day together, watching the snow fall, talking about their life, their children, their many blessings. As evening came and the storm grew worse, Garrett felt a deep peace settle over him. He had lived a good life, a full life, a life with meaning and purpose and, most importantly, love. "I love you, Rose Vance," he said, holding her hand as they sat by the fire. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you behind that bank desk, and I will love you beyond whatever comes next." "I love you too," Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. "Always and forever." That night, Garrett died peacefully in his sleep, with Rose beside him just as she had been for 47 years. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, marking the passing of a good man. Rose grieved, as anyone would grieve the loss of a beloved partner. But she also celebrated the life they had shared, the love that had sustained them through nearly 5 decades together. She lived for 5 more years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, telling stories about Garrett, about their life together, about the cowboy who walked 20 miles through a blizzard to bring her a ring and a marriage proposal. When Rose died at 73, she was buried beside Garrett on a hill overlooking their ranch, with a headstone that read, "Together always." Their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate a life well lived, a love that had endured, a legacy that would continue through the generations they had created. Malcolm, now in his 50s and a grandfather himself, stood at his mother's grave and thought about the courage it must have taken for his father to walk through that blizzard, the determination it must have taken for his mother to build a life in a wild territory, the love that had sustained them both through all the years that followed. "They gave us everything," he said to his siblings, gathered around him. Ruth, James, and Grace, all of them middle-aged now with their own children and grandchildren. A foundation built on love and stubbornness, and refusing to give up when things got hard. That is a legacy worth honoring. And they did honor it, all of them carrying forward the lessons their parents had taught them. Malcolm ran the bank with integrity and innovation, building it into one of the largest financial institutions in Montana. Ruth became a renowned educator, establishing several schools throughout the state. James expanded the ranch, making it one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. And Grace's music brought joy to thousands, her compositions performed across the country. But more than their professional accomplishments, they carried forward the example of their parents' marriage. They taught their own children about commitment, about partnership, about the kind of love that endures through hardship and celebration alike. They told the story of the cowboy who walked through a blizzard, the banker who said yes, and the beautiful life they built together in the wild Montana territory. The house Garrett and Rose had built stood for another 50 years, eventually becoming a historical landmark in Victor. The bank Malcolm ran eventually became part of a larger institution, but it kept the Kennedy Vance name in honor of its founders. The ranch James operated continued for generations, still in the family, still prosperous. But the real legacy, the one that mattered most, was the love story that started with a desperate walk through a blizzard and ended with two people buried side by side on a Montana hillside, together always, just as they had promised. It was a story told and retold through the generations, a reminder that the greatest adventures often start with a single courageous step forward into the unknown toward love. And sometimes, if you are lucky and stubborn and willing to risk everything, that step leads you exactly where you were meant to be all along.